On today's episode, I sit down with Andrea Miller, who is a psychologist out of California, and she specializes in helping people tame the inner critic. You know, that voice, that niggling voice that's constantly telling you you're not good enough, you can't do this, and who the hell do you think you are for wanting to do this? You know, that voice that just creates so many limitations in your life. Andrea specializes in helping people tame that voice. We had such a rich and insightful conversation around why we have that critical voice, what to do about it, how to manage it, knowing that it's never really going to go away because it has a reason for being there, but also how to live a thriving life despite this voice being there, how to maybe befriend it a little bit, put it in its place. I learned so much from Andrea in this conversation. I know that you're going to learn a ton. I'm really excited for you to tune into this episode. If you enjoyed this episode and you found it enriching, consider leaving a review of the podcast. I would really, really appreciate that. So let's tune in to this interview. It's a gooder. Welcome to Mental Makeover Radio, your go-to destination for meaningful conversations about mental health. I'm your host and your trusted therapist bestie, Cecilia Mannella. Join us as we explore the complexities and messiness of human experience by addressing your questions and concerns. I'm here to provide a straightforward and practical therapy advice. So grab your favorite beverage, whether it's tea, coffee, or whatever tickles your taste buds, and get ready to embark on a mental makeover. Hello and welcome to Mental Makeover Radio. I am your host, Cecilia Mannella, and I am here with my friend and colleague, Andrea Miller. Welcome, Andrea.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, really excited to have you. We are going to dive into a listener's question in a little bit, but I would love to know more about your journey around how did you come to be where you are in life? What was little Andrea like? Give us a little bit of the tea of your story.
Sure. So I have been a psychologist for about 20 years, and little Andrea, I'm a first-gen American, German American,
Mhm.
and so in some ways I kind of always felt a little out of place, and I think that began my journey into being introspective, thinking about who I am and how do I fit in, and in some ways what's wrong with me.
Mhm.
And as I grew up, it just was something. I read a lot of books. I talked to a lot of people. I went to my own therapist when I was in high school. Had a lot of questions about my place in the world, in my family, and that just eventually led to my decision to go into becoming a therapist. I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to help others who were feeling similarly to me, helping them
Mhm.
find their place to feel good about creating a life that they find meaningful
Mhm.
and just feeling joy.
I know. It's so interesting. I'm also first generation Canadian. Both my parents are immigrants. And it's funny how that feeling of displacement almost, or like existing in two worlds, having a foot in kind of different cultures all the time, leads you to want to understand yourself a little bit more. But I find that a lot of people in the helping field are have had these kind of experiences where they're like they had their own experiences of maybe not belonging or not feeling good enough or questioning where they fit, and they end up in professions where they help other people figure it out. So I find that really interesting.
Yeah, well, I think that experience certainly uh, has made me have compassion or a feeling of empathy for others
Mhm.
who are questioning or struggling.
Mhm. And how did you get into like how did you decide psychotherapy? Was that like your first idea as a teenager when you're done high school, like this is what I'm going to do, or did you hopscotch your way into it, or what was that like?
It's a funny story. So when I was in college, I was a communications major, and I always thought I wanted to go into something with human development, but I thought advertising. But I, but I was a person who didn't own a TV, who hated ads, like, and I realized, I know, I realized I did
That's so
not want to
funny.
spend my time figuring out ways to have people buy toilet paper or something, right? So I realized,
I
okay,
love
that
that.
is not going to work for me. And but human development, that's sort of what motivates people. What how did they become who they are was always part of the appeal. And so I
Right.
just shifted into psychology, and then started
Mm,
taking classes and realized, wow, I'm really interested in this. I started doing volunteer work, and every time it was like, yeah, this feels right. And that
yeah,
just kind of kept
that's
me going.
yeah, and just kind of like leads the path to where you need to go. Yeah, that's good. And so, in your psychotherapy practice, is there a certain client that you kind of focus on, or has that evolved over the last 20 years? What's that been like for you?
Well, when I first started, I worked in community clinics, and so I worked a
Mm,
lot with more severely mentally ill,
mhm,
and also people who were in poverty, and really working with them to help them kind of come out of poverty.
mm,
And then I switched to working with college students. I worked in a college in a college counseling center,
mhm,
and now I mostly do private practice. So
mhm.
I really enjoy working with all ages, adults, but all age
Right.
range of adults. And I find the core issue that's pretty consistent is a sense of self worth,
Mhm.
a sense of I deserve to be here, I'm worthy to create a life that I love and that
Right.
aligns with who I am. And
Mhm.
at root, it really is. Most of the time a question of, is it okay for me to say what I need and want and have my life reflect that?
Yeah.
Um, yeah. And that leads to a lot of anxiety and a lot of depression and um,
Yeah. It
deep.
tends to ripple out into other things. Yeah.
Yes, that's
Into other
that's what
problems
I
for sure.
find.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so interesting how that works. Well, it lines up really perfectly with a question that we have from an audience member. So Laura writes, "How can I change my negative self-talk?" Which is, by the way, a super huge question. No matter what I try to do, I always feel like I'm not good enough. My brain keeps on telling me that I'm failing at everything. How do I change how I talk to myself? It's exhausting to try to battle all this negative self-talk. So, such a great topic for us to dive into. Where would you start with Laura around exploring negative self-talk and how to change that?
hmm It's a biggie.
I know,
Um,
right?
I think that probably none of us get away in this life without having some negative self-talk.
Mm,
Um,
I
for
agree.
many of us, it can be super paralyzing.
Mhm.
And so I think that would be where I would start, is just to say, wow, this is something that most of us struggle with or suffer from,
Right.
and that it is something that we can change. That
Mhm.
our we A lot of times we think, oh, our thoughts are just what they are. And yet, truthfully, or we learn that we can actually do a lot to change our thought patterns and
Right.
help us to feel better. That those voices on our head are not necessarily telling us the truth. In fact, that inner negative voice, which I call the inner critic, is often it's a voice of safety and survival. In other words, it's there because it's trying to make sure that we don't go outside of the safety zone, certain parameters to keep us safe.
Right.
Now, it may speak to us when, we're about to cross the street and there's a car coming and there's actual fear, like,
Right.
stop, stop, don't go. But a lot of times it's fear that's just we've learned to take on, and it's
Mm,
not actually going to be harmful, but we think it is,
right.
right? And those messages are often things that we heard when we were growing up from family
Mhm.
members, from our culture, from teachers, other people that were important. And it feels like those are important to our very survival,
Right.
to getting love, connection, which is what we need to survive when we're kids.
Yeah.
But we internalize those, and we think that that must be true,
Right.
that I have to follow those shoulds or those rules in order to be safe in my world. So that voice starts going louder, getting louder
Mm,
when we want to step out of that, when we want to try something new, when we take a risk, or even when things don't go right
mhm.
because we're feeling, I don't know, rejected or like a failure. It steps up and it's like, who do you think you are? Why are you doing this?
Right.
Because it wants to keep us from feeling those difficult feelings.
For sure. So much to unpack there because I think, yes, I think most people don't understand how the brain functions in general. And that I think there's a lot of people that think we're like super evolved, and we are in many ways. But the truth is our brain is really not that much different than it was, I mean, to at least like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago and thousands of years ago. And this idea of this inner critic, which is, I think, really, you talked about survival. It's like it used to protect us from the saber-tooth tigers and, the bears, and let's say extreme winter, or like all these other things, famine, all the things that we actually, as a human species used to live with on the regular, where we needed that kind of internal guide or internal fear driven part of us to say, hey, my job is to keep you alive, and here are the things that are going to possibly kill you, so stay away from all the things that are probably going to kill you. But in today's world, I mean, I don't encounter saber-tooth tigers, right? And so we don't encounter these extreme, let's say, threats to our life. So then I think that voice attaches itself to other things. And all of a sudden the phone, or like scrolling on social media, feels like life or death, whether someone likes your photo or not. And it's the same system. It's just attaching itself to this new world, which is very different than kind of what we were dealing with not that long ago.
Right. I totally agree. I think it hasn't evolved
Mhm.
into where we are today. But another piece to that that I think is so key is that if you think about when a baby is born, if you have
Mhm.
your own child or you have a younger sibling, that you see
Mhm.
the baby comes into the world and the way it begins to understand itself is by how others respond to it, the
Right.
messages it gets. It begins to go, oh, this is okay, this is not okay, or when
Right.
I do this, mom is mad at me, so I
Mhm.
maybe shouldn't do that in order to feel safe, right?
Safe. Yeah.
And those messages are then just sort of absorbed as truth. Like, this is the way the world works. We don't have the capacity as children to question, oh, mom just had a crazy day. Mom's really stressed out. No wonder she's upset. It's not
Right.
me, it's her. We
It's
think,
her
oh, if
job. It's her boss who's an asshole, or
right, or she just
when
had a
you're
fight with
right.
her
Right.
dad, or my
Right.
dad, or her husband.
Right.
And as children, we don't have that ability to reflect and go, oh,
Mhm.
that's not me, that's them.
Right.
I'm actually okay. I'm a lovable little being, and they're having a crappy day.
Right.
We take it on as there must be some, I must be too much. I must be too loud. Maybe, my asking for something, upset them. I shouldn't ask for
Mhm.
things. So that's really another piece of how this
Yeah.
develops. And that inner critic is then trying to keep us in line so we don't lose the love of our
Mhm.
partner, our parent, this our our friend group, whoever
Right.
whoever it might be, and we don't ever question those because they started
Right.
when we were really, really little.
Right. And so it's like a running tally, let's say. Like it's a whole long list that we have that we don't ever question. Like we've kind of, as children, made notes on them, and we keep track of it, and our brain keeps track of it. And it's like, these are the rules to live by, right? This is what I need to do to
Yes.
get love, acceptance, belonging, safety, potentially. Um, and then we just like take them as truth without questioning them.
That's right. And they
Mhm.
may have actually worked for us when we were kids. But as
Right.
adults, they may be getting in the way of our ability to move forward and to create a life that we love because they're limiting. And the world may respond differently to us. And we can't even see that because, the lens of our glasses looks a certain way that
Right.
we're worried that if we, ask for the promotion, or whatever, our friend's going to be envious and angry, or,
Right.
or, or whatever.
Yeah. How
Yeah.
do you help people start with auditing these thoughts, or like excavating them, because sometimes it feels like you need an excavator to go in there and like dig this shit out. So like what are some of the first things that Laura can do, or anyone who's listening can do, to start to really dig out what are some of those that inner critic, or those voices, or those messages?
hmm Yeah, there's a lot that Laura can do. That's the good
Mhm.
news. I think the first thing is realizing that that inner critic is not the voice of truth,
Mhm.
that it's oftentimes the loudest voice because it's been kind of taken control because it's about that safety,
Right.
but that
That's a good
actually
point.
there are other voices, and one of those is a more compassionate voice. I could call it the inner sage, you could call it the inner mentor, wise woman, coach, that we actually want to build and strengthen to kind of counterbalance that inner critic.
Right.
So the first thing though is to really just start to recognize, oh, there's my inner critic speaking again.
Mhm.
Oh, there goes that inner critic again. Um, and to realize that that's not the truth. It's
Right.
just got an agenda and a job and it's trying to do it.
Right.
So one of the things I like to do is say, hey, thanks for, sharing, but I've got this.
Yeah.
And it's a start of sort of separating from it, having
Mhm.
some distance from it, and
Mhm.
being able to also then another step would be to say, is that really true what that inner critic is saying?
Mhm.
No, it's not true. Again, thanks for sharing, and I'm going to still go ahead and do that thing,
Right.
right?
It's creating some space between myself and this voice, right? I think that often people own it as part of their identity and they don't realize that it doesn't have to be part of their identity. There can be something that creates a little bit of space and being able to disconnect from it being about you, but being a voice. And I'm a big fan of, I'm not sure if you are too, but of really like visualizing what this inner voice, like this critic actually looks like. I know when I did some of this work in my early 20s, to me, the in my inner critic is like this old woman who's probably like over 80 and she's like sitting with a cigarette in this chair. I'm not sure why she's smoking, by the way, but she's smoking. And she has a super raspy voice and she just says the worst shit to me all the time. She's constantly like saying things like, "Oh, you can't do that. Who the hell do you think you are?" But when I was able to visualize, like actually create her in a way, then not only the voice become like clear for me to identify because it was like, "Oh, this is not my voice. This is her voice." But it gave us some space for my own identity away from it. And so I love doing that kind of visualization work around it.
It's such a great exercise. I've done that as well.
Mhm.
My inner critic is male, and it's a judge, and it's a judge that
Oh,
wears one of those white wigs, and
yes.
he's
Yes.
standing up above on one of those pedestals looking down at me, pointing me like, "What the hell are you doing? What are you thinking?" I mean, it's a and it it was also so helpful to visualize it. I looked on Google to find, a
Oh,
picture of
oh,
him.
fun.
I call him the judge, so naming it can be really
Yeah.
helpful. And just yeah, it gives you some distance to go, oh, there's a judge talking to me again. You know, no, sorry, it's not true.
Mm,
Um, Another thing, speaking to creating that distance, is rather than saying, I am a loser, if that's
right.
going in your head, to say the critic
Critic. Mhm.
says I'm a loser. Just another level of distance
Mhm.
from, oh, it's that voice.
Yeah.
It's not the voice of truth, it's the voice of that inner critic.
Yeah. And also for people to realize that sometimes the voice of that inner critic is a family member. Right?
Right.
That it can actually manifest as in like, "Oh, that's the voice of my dad, my mom, my uncle, my grandpa, my sister, my whatever." Like, it can actually manifest in somebody that was in your childhood who was perhaps, like, really critical or verbally abusive or would just say things, like, without thinking about them or harmful things that we've internalized these messages and we actually hear them almost in their voice in our heads.
That is so true. It can be anyone who was important. It could be a teacher, could have been a coach.
Mm.
I also think that, especially for women, there are so many societal messages about what's okay for us as women to
Mm.
how we should be, how we shouldn't be, the good girl messages, how we should
Right.
look and now I think with social media, that pressure has gotten even more intense. That
Yeah.
external validation. And if we're not doing that, that critic is going, you know, what are you doing?
Mm.
You're a failure, or you're ugly, or you're not good
Mhm.
enough, or if we choose to take a
Mhm.
different perhaps path than what we were told we should
Mhm.
be doing. I think should
Right.
is another clue. Any should
Yes.
statements that, oh, this is some external thing that
Mhm.
I've internalized about what's right or wrong or okay or not, that we can begin to question.
Mhm.
Is that truly how I feel? Is that how I want? Does that align with my beliefs about what I
Right.
want for my life?
So true. And, and I think men experience this too, but men don't talk about it. I don't think men are very open with saying, well, I should be doing this because this is what men do, or I should be behaving this way, or I should be strong. I shouldn't show emotion. It's if I cry, I'm a weak, I'm whatever. Like these messages are out there. I think men hold them too, but I just don't think that men talk about them as openly as women do. I think women were a little bit more willing to say, like, there's some crazy shit happening in my head. Whereas I
Mhm.
think men really believe those to be the standard. They really do believe that that is what it means to be a man in the world. And they don't necessarily share that inner critic piece of it because there's shame attached to it. When you share some of these things that are happening in your mind, that when we say them out loud, it can be really shameful.
Yeah, I think that men get the message that it's not okay to talk about feelings. It's not
Mhm.
okay to be scared. It's not okay to be upset about something. And so don't talk about it because then you're not a
Mhm.
real man. That pressure is
Right,
very different, I think. That message
right.
is different for men than for women. I think
Mhm.
for women it's more okay to say, I'm not feeling great or I'm upset or
Mhm.
this made me really sad.
Mhm.
Like and so that is a way that I think boys and men can
Mhm.
be very hamstrung. In other words, not
I think so
free
too.
to be honest and real about and ask for support. It's
Mhm.
very lonely, I think, sometimes for
For
men
men.
and young, and boys and young men.
Yeah. I mean, the suicide rates around among men is on the rise. Like, we are in a mental health crisis for men too at this point because they are so isolated. And I think the difference is also with women, and I'm curious what your thoughts on this, is that what I notice in my own life, auditing my own life, but also what I see in the work that I do, is that women bond with each other over their inner critic. Like, we'll be like, "Oh my god, I'm so fat." And then someone's, "You think you're fat? You're beautiful. Look at my thighs. This is what the diet I'm on. Oh my god, I read this thing about the." And so it's almost like this inner critic comes to life in the way that we bond with each other. And so we build relationships with each other's critic at the same time that we're building relationships with each other. It's this very weird thing, fascinating thing I think that women do that men don't necessarily do. Men don't build connection over their inner critic. And I feel like women easily will say these awful things about themselves to their friends. And then the response is like, now we're bonding over this thing.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's easier to bond around what isn't working or how
Hmm.
we aren't. I don't know. We failed at something, or than to bond around what's great in our life or what's working. And part of that, I think, is the inner critic is shaming us around. And the
Yes.
messaging we've gotten is don't be too, big for your britches. Don't be, you
Right.
know, and or envy among girlfriends or
Right. Don't
something.
be arrogant.
Don't be arrogant. Don't be too
Right.
much. And
Hmm.
uh, that's part of the process of change is finding people who can support you as you're developing and growing
Hmm.
and building your life in positive ways.
Right. Let's talk about the inner sage or the inner wise person. How do we, in speaking to Laura and everybody else listening, like, how do you start to tune into that voice and how do you amplify that voice that's already there?
hmm So one of the best ways to start is to imagine how would you talk to a friend if she
Mhm.
came to you and said what you've been saying to yourself, you know.
Right.
And probably you would never talk to a friend like you talk with yourself,
Mhm.
right? You'd be supportive and kind and ask
Loving.
and loving and maybe even ask your friend, how what is it you need? How can I
Mhm.
best help you with this, or how can I support you in this way?
Mhm.
And so just to really ask yourself, how might I respond to this to myself as if I were a
Mhm.
friend. So
Right.
I think that's one place to start. Also to imagine like someone that you love, like you could in your mind's eye, someone that you love, and what they might say to you
Mhm.
if you were hurt or sad or upset. Like if you had a great relationship with your grandmother, or if you have a coach or someone else, you know,
Mhm.
to remind you
Right.
of that it's okay to be compassionate towards yourself.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, and and if you don't have one, make one up. Like, there's also that piece of it. So just as much as I love to kind of create a vision of what the inner critic looks like, I love being able to create this almost like an alter ego or a version of something that is this wise person. And for years and years and years for me, it's been Wonder Woman, and I talk about it all the time because there's this embodiment to me of what I want, which is strength without arrogance,
Hmm.
generosity with boundaries. This idea of taking up space and not apologizing for taking up space, yet not being cruel to other people. Like there's this, to me, the fantasy of Wonder Woman is something that I've connected with for many, many, many years. And so for people who maybe don't even have a positive experience with somebody, you can connect to characters that speak to you.
Right, right. Exactly. So it could be a movie
Mhm.
character, it could be somebody that in a
Mhm.
book.
Yeah, book
It
character.
could be a historical character, absolutely.
Mm.
Um, the image I have in my mind is kind of a funny one. It's sort of a goddess. She's this woman with long, long, I don't know, she has silver hair,
I love
and
it.
she's like got this long flowing robe, and she's very wise and gentle and kind, and yeah, she's even got like a little crystal ball or something. It's kind of yeah.
I love it.
Um, but I think that's a really yeah, that's a great way to begin to create that for yourself, is to
Mhm.
find a movie character that you can relate to.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and being able to at
yeah,
least to be able to see the different voices and hear the different voices that are actually happening and not believing them to be true. So I think what you said about that is really important, is that we don't have to believe everything we think.
exactly,
Mhm.
exactly.
That our mind does play tricks on us sometimes.
Yeah, and sometimes our inner critic is very crafty, and when we
Mm.
say something kind to ourselves, it's like, oh, you don't deserve that. I mean, the inner critic
Right.
can really get in there and even find ways to dismantle a positive voice.
Right.
You don't deserve that, or actually, if you're too kind to yourself, you're going to get soft and not be motivated and all those things. And so it's a
Or
good
you're not gonna be
liar,
safe. Like,
or
don't
you're
let your
not going to
guard
be
down,
safe.
because if you let your guard down, people are gonna hurt you or harm you, or like it can go to that place of safety. Like you can't show vulnerability because then this X, Y, and Z is gonna happen to you.
Right, exactly.
Mhm.
And maybe there is a kernel of truth in that perhaps when you were growing up, or you've had
Mhm.
experiences where you were vulnerable and somebody wasn't kind. And so some of it is also finding those people now in your life
Mhm.
and learning how to determine, is this a safe person for me to open up to or not?
Right.
And I always, when I work with this with clients, I I say it's kind of like dating. You gradually get to know
Yeah.
someone, and you sort of determine based on how they respond, or
Mhm.
how they behave, whether they're trustworthy. And
Right.
you incrementally open up. You don't share
Mhm.
your deepest vulnerabilities, your heart, or whatever pain might be there
Right.
at the from the day one, right? You
Right.
wait and see, are they worthy of gaining my
Right.
you know my heart?
Mhm. Yeah.
And
And
not
how do you
everyone is.
suggest yeah, how do you suggest making that distinction on how to measure that? I know last time we talked earlier, we talked about aligning with values, and maybe that's what you use
Mhm.
to make those connections.
Well, I think to start with, though, it's like, does this person show up for me when they say
Mm,
they will? Do they
yeah,
keep their word? Can I trust them with things I've shared and said I want to keep the private? Are they
right,
gossiping about me? Do they call me when they say they will?
right,
Do they have my back?
right.
Are they reaching out to me? Is this a two-way relationship? So those kind of things are, I think, great signs of
Mhm,
really, can you take that next step to deepen the relationship? Um,
right,
and I think certainly values would be another piece. Are
yeah,
are your values aligned with that person? But that's also another way to really, it's a sort of framework or a guide to for your own self to develop a life that really has meaning for you. And it's also a way to talk back to the inner critic. It's like, if you are doing
mm.
something that's aligned with your values and the inner critic starts to yammer at you, you can say, this is really important to me, and this is aligned with that.
Right,
I'm going to move forward on this. So
right,
taking some time to maybe explore, what are the top values. Is it honesty, is it connection,
mhm,
is it love, is it um, assertiveness? There's many, many lists
right,
of qualities that you can just Google
mhm,
and kind of go through them and see which ones um,
Mhm.
you know, kind of light up for you, which
For
ones you're
sure.
drawn to, and then
Yeah.
use those as a way to guide you in making decisions.
Right. Yeah, and I think it would be interesting to also do the same exercise for the inner critic. Like, what are the values of the inner critic, and what does it actually want for you in many ways? Like, we assume it's telling the truth, and we assume it's to keep us safe. But if again, if I'm not being attacked by saber tooth tigers all the time, if the threat isn't necessarily real, then what is the ultimate goal of that inner critic? Well, sometimes it's just to keep us small. It's to
Right.
limit our life. It's to not see what the possibilities of what's out there. Maybe the values they hold is more about control, right? Or maybe like it'd be interesting for Laura to dive into like what are the values of the inner critic versus what are my values? And maybe
Hmm.
these don't really align. And that I mean that's a great thing if they don't align because it allows you a little bit more space in between so it doesn't feel like you're taking that on so much.
Right. The inner critic is really all about its idea of keeping you safe,
Mhm.
right? And uh, that's based on this idea of what is safety, and that may not be aligned at all with the values a person has in terms of creating a life. And that's where that inner sage
Mm.
or wise woman coming in and going, it's all right if you take that chance. It's all right
Yeah.
if you take a risk here. I'm here and I'm going to be here to, soften the fall if that's what happens,
Right.
or tell you that I believe in you and we can keep doing and keep trying,
Right.
and we don't have to listen to that inner critic.
Right.
Without that, it becomes really hard to take risks,
Yeah, that
without
makes
having
sense.
some voice of compassion.
Right. Do you think that the voice of the inner critic, you said something that triggered something for me. You said it's the inner critic's goal is its version of keeping you safe. And do you think that its version of keeping you safe goes back to like goes way back? Do you think that version of safety ever evolves as your life evolves or do you think it's stuck in the past?
I think it's definitely birthed in the past, and
Yeah.
then experiences we have as we go through life tend to align with those and maybe strengthen
Mm,
certain parts of that, and other ones maybe recede.
makes sense. Yeah.
Let's say we are in a really healthy, loving relationship. Perhaps our inner voice is not going to be as loud if we're
Right.
considering dating again because we're like, oh,
Right.
we know how to find that place of safety in
Right.
relationship. But if things have happened that align or are similar to what happened in certain areas, then it's that part may become
Mm.
louder or more like hey, 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 don't do that.
Right. Yeah. And I imagine also the inner critic like cherry picks the stories to make it stronger. So like in an experience, let's say, it'll kind of pick the experiences that reinforce its agenda versus seeing the entire story because there's there's something to be learned in everything, right? And so not even in rejection, there's something to be learned in there. But I imagine that the inner critic just goes, "Don't do that because this happened." Versus what is the lesson to be learned here?
Absolutely. What is a lesson to be learned here is more the voice of the inner sage,
Right.
right? It's more like we can learn from this. It doesn't mean we're a bad person.
Right.
How can we learn and grow?
Mhm.
Whereas the inner critic is like, if that happens, that means you're not a good person, or you're unworthy, or you're right. It takes all of the data that supports its
Right.
beliefs, and the rest of it, it tries to get
Get
you,
rid
it
of.
tries to distract you and not have you see that. Yeah.
It's kind of like the algorithm on social media. It's like, oh, it's just going to give you all the things that it wants to reinforce and get rid of everything else. So it doesn't really provide you any kind of balanced view of anything. It's just a very single tracked way of presenting information to you.
Right, exactly. And our mind is also leaning in the direction of what they call a negativity bias,
Yes.
again, out of a way of keeping us safe. So those things that are potentially dangerous, like we actually pay more attention to them. That's
Mhm.
just how our brain is wired. And so
Yes.
some of it is really also making a conscious effort to remember, it's like the old saying, and I certainly had this experience, like you get a report card and you have all A's and one B. What do what my parents focused on was the B. And I just thought,
Right.
oh, it was a piece of crap, when it was like,
Mhm.
no, actually I did really,
Mhm.
really well. And there's an area that maybe I can take some steps to improve in. But actually, let's, be excited and proud, right? So, but that's
Mhm.
how the brain works. It's noticing those negatives and
Always.
trying to protect you and prepare itself for those things. So it's really a great practice to also
Mhm.
find that balance and go, but wait, there's some good things here too. There's things I can learn
Mhm.
from and use to my
Right.
benefit.
And I think it's about hacking the brain in that way. It's really understanding that your brain is wired for negativity. Like we'd love to think it's not, but that's actually not true. It's always wired for fear. It's always wired to find danger. And when it doesn't find danger, it will create danger sometimes just for the sake of doing it. Because that's, I mean, essentially, like it's not very different than we were like lived in caves, right? Like it really is wired to protect you and keep you safe. And it's not really, we haven't evolved to live in this time of abundance that we live in right now and our access to resources in the same way that we have access to. And so
Right.
sometimes it just creates shit. Like it just, and there's like fear statements, right? Like, what if this happens? And it's like, well, okay, whatever. Um, and not really taking it as truth all the time. It's remembering that. I think that's important.
Yeah, I think to remember that it's the brain's goal is our survival. It is not our happiness.
Oh, I love that. It's such a great, oh, yes, it's for survival, not for happiness. Mhm.
Right. And so we think, well, why isn't my brain thinking about happiness? There must be something wrong. But no, that's just the
Mhm.
brain's slant. And so it
Mhm.
really just requires a more focused effort on our own to really remember these good things, you know, to shift to becoming aware of,
Mhm.
you know, the joyful things that are happening every day. And to remember
Right.
there's going to be a combination of like the day will never come when everything is just right.
Right.
And the day will never come that my inner critic is not active. It has
Right.
definitely been tamed in my mind, and that's kind of what I think is the goal: is really
Right.
taming it and
Right.
recognizing. I love this. Are you familiar with Elizabeth Gilbert? She wrote
Yes.
she wrote the
Yes.
book on create magic. What was it
Big
called? The
magic. Big magic.
Big magic, yes. So she
Mhm.
has this example of when she starts out on a new project, there's her creativity and there's the inner critic. And she says, inner critic never gets to be in the driver's seat. It is never the one at the steering wheel. Inner critic's in the back seat.
Buckled
Creativity is
up.
next to me,
Mhm.
buckled up, yeah, and
Yep.
creativity sits in the front with me and I'm driving. And I
Yes.
love that image. It's like
Mhm.
the inner critic is there and it's saying whatever it's saying, and we can go, oh, thanks for sharing. Get
Yep.
back in your place. And let me
Yeah.
talk to creativity about what I want to create,
Mhm.
what I want to make happen in my life.
Oh, it's such a good point because I feel like everyone's like just wants to be happy all the time. I'm constantly saying like happiness is not a state of being. It's an emotion we feel in reaction to something that's happening. But
That's right.
like to really understand like we are not wired for happiness.
That's
And
right.
we think we are. And when we don't feel happy, we're like, oh, something must be wrong in my life. Something's happening. And it's like, well, we're not created that way. We're not wired for happiness. We're wired for survival, which is
That's
very
right.
different.
That's
Yes.
right. And the
Hmm.
inner critic loves to jump on us on that one too. Like, oh, you're not happy all the time? What's wrong with
Right.
you?
Something must be wrong. You must be doing
Something must
this
be wrong.
wrong, this wrong, this relationship must be wrong, work must be wrong. It's trying to find like where's the source of unhappiness versus really sitting in that place of like, well, there is a balance here. Like we need to have a conversation with these different parts of ourselves or these voices to explore what's actually happening and getting to the root of things.
And also to decide to have an intention that it's all right to be happy too.
Hmm. Yeah.
That I can have this messy live life, that
Yes.
some things are really hard or not going exactly as I want, but I can also really appreciate
Mm-hmm.
the beautiful sunshine and my friendships or whatever those things are, and that's okay. I think sometimes we think We have to wait until everything's just right,
Mm.
until we can feel a sense of happiness. But we're worthy. We are basically worthy from day one, is how I see it. We're
Right.
born worthy. What little baby isn't
Mm.
worthy? If you look at them, they're beautiful.
Right.
And then things start to happen where the child starts to question themselves because of the
Right.
responses they've gotten, which were not about them.
Right.
Well, most
It
of the
was
time.
never about them.
It was never about them.
Yeah. And part of that
Right.
is giving yourself permission to let that piece go. It is
Right.
letting go of perfection around like everything has to be perfect before either I feel happy or I'm deserving of happiness, that we can be joyful in the midst of, chaotic life sometimes. And that's totally okay.
Right.
Yeah. It's like that inner, wise person gives you a lot of permission to just be human.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And being human is messy.
Oh my gosh, it's so messy, right? So, so messy. Andrea, this was so great. This
Hmm.
such a great conversation. I know that so many people are going to relate to it. Where can people find you? I know that you're doing a webinar soon.
Yeah, I'm going to be doing a webinar in April, on April 6th, through Eventbrite, and it's called Three Keys to Overcoming Self-Doubt and
Love
Cultivating
it.
Self-Worth. So we'll be going over in some of the same things that we talked about, but with more
Mm.
exercises and more strategies.
That's great.
Um,
We'll put the link into that into the show notes,
Great.
so people can find you and sign up for that. So I think that's
Wonderful.
wonderful. Yeah, it's so great. So I have a tradition on the podcast that I started recently that I did not tell you about. Um, the previous guest leaves a question for the next guest without knowing who the next guest is.
Oh, wow.
Okay. So the question that was left for you is, what is the information that you trust when you're making a decision on something you've never done before?
Hmm. That's a very interesting question.
I know. There's some doozies. It's great.
Yeah.
And just think about it. You get to leave a doozy for the next person. So,
It's interesting because over time, and I think this is with the advent of Google, I have become a
mm,
person who has to like more and more and more and more information, and
mm.
that actually takes me down a rabbit hole where
Oh,
it's
yeah.
like at some point I have to just decide what
Yes.
feels right. And so I've really been working on that actually within myself, is that more information doesn't necessarily lead me to a place of making a decision. So,
Right.
oftentimes trusting, talking to someone that I trust, either
Mm-hmm.
someone who's been there and done that, or just someone who
Mm-hmm.
knows me well, and then
Mm-hmm.
really checking in with what does it feel like.
Mm.
So a little information gathering, connecting with those people that I trust, and also really checking in with myself. And I think, like we've talked about, is this an alignment with my values and what I want to
Right.
create in my life?
I love that. So you kind of go inside to find out.
Yeah, and I've gotten to a point in my life now where if I try something and it isn't right, it doesn't become this, the inner critic doesn't just nail
Right.
me down. I
Right.
can just say, this is a learning. I'm learning here, and this
Right.
wasn't the right path. I can go down a different path. It's okay.
I love that so much. Andrea,
Yeah.
thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. This was a pleasure.
It was so great.